Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Swainson, and I'm a trustee of LitFest, the Lancaster Literature Festival. This is LitFest's first hybrid festival. That is, it is designed to be live and live streamed, meaning that those who prefer to stay in can watch at home, while those who want to venture out in public can come to our venues, and that those who can't make that date, either in person or online, can catch up later by watching it on Crowdcast at some point in the following 30 days. LitFest is supported by a number of statutory bodies, so thank you to Lancaster City Council particularly, who have supported us from the beginning since 1978. It is also funded by foundations, collaborators and partners and sponsors, and above all it is supported by you, our audiences. After the event, please take the time to visit our excellent online bookshop where you will find all the festival's books at special prices, and please also make a donation, however small, to support our work, because this will allow us to continue in the future. Now to the event and the speakers. But the first thing I need to say is that when we planned this event, we had originally asked Geraldine Onek of Lancaster Black History Group, and who is also a Lancaster primary school teacher, to come and be part of the conversation. But sadly, COVID intervened again, and Geraldine has had to withdraw. But she had been reading Richard and Alex's books alongside her sister Petra, and I'm very glad to say that Petra has kindly stepped in today alongside Sunita Abraham to take on the role of Geraldine. So Sunita Abraham will talk about the work of Lancaster Black History Group, and then Petra will discuss with Richard and Alex how they came to write their books, and Richard and Alex will each give a short talk about that. And then together all four will discuss how the work being done by Lancaster Black History Group, the University's Atlantic Slave Trade Project, and these two books and others like them are helping us to gain a truer understanding of British history and its legacies. Now, LBHG has kindly provided a reading list that will be posted on our website shortly. This is a general introduction to the slave trade, but with also specialist angles, and it's absolutely first rate. But as a publisher and former bookseller, I feel bound to put in the current paperback editions so that if you want to get them or get the ebook, you can do so easily. So now to our speakers. Sitting next to Sunita Abraham is Richard Atkinson. Richard is a book publisher. He lives in London but holds a deep-rooted affection for the north of England, where his ancestors come from. His book, Mr. Atkinson's Rum Contract, was published to outstanding reviews in 2020. The novelist Monica Ali calling it a towering achievement, shot through with intelligent warmth and compassion. Next to Richard is Alex Renton. Alex is a journalist who has won awards for his work as an investigator, war correspondent, and food policy writer. He lives in Edinburgh. His book, Blood Legacy, was published last year, also to outstanding reviews. Sathnam Sanghera, author of Empire Land, described it as an incredible work of scholarship. Sunita Abraham is an associate lecturer at Lancaster University, whose current research focuses on issues of race, colonialism, decolonisation, and inequality. In particular, she is interested in examining how higher educational institutions can bring about systemic change through various decolonising initiatives that link staff and students with each other and with local and regional communities. And on the extreme right from me is Petra Onek, currently Lancaster's first and only Chef of the Year at Lancaster's only fully plant-based restaurant, the Herbarium, where Richard and Alex and separately Anthony Grayling and I all found ourselves having lunch today.
It's very good.
It would be better if you'd been cooking.
It would. I have a great team though, I'm sure they did you right.
And Petra is also the founder of Peas and Q's, P-E-A-S, Peas and Q's dining experience, a luxury vegan ready-to-heat service and private chef business. So now you know if you didn't know before. So I'm going to ask Sunita to start things off by describing the work of the Lancaster Black History Group. Over to you, Sunita.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you very much to the Lit Fest for giving us a chance, Lancaster Black History Group, a chance to tell you a little bit more about what we do. So I'm standing here very much as a representative of a group of us that came together in June 2020, very much inspired, I guess, by the Black Lives Matter protests after George Floyd's murder. And we felt that we needed to do more than just talk about it. So we wanted to make the moment into a movement. And that is what Lancaster Black History Group has sought to do in this last 2 years. So we're coming up in June to 2 years since we started. When we started, our group, the co-founders of that were Geraldine Onek and Rebecca Novell, and we've got a whole suite of other people now who are involved in it. They include school students, university students, school teachers, academics, activists, historians, and Alan Rice, who isn't here today, and Imogen is here. She's part of Lancaster Black History Group. I can't see anyone else who's part of Lancaster Black History Group here today. But if you're online, lovely to see you. Alan Rice has been I guess in many ways, the face of Lancaster's link to Black history in terms of the slave trails that he has done over the years. So inspired by our conversations, we decided to, and our decision that we would fight racism through education, we embarked on a series of research projects, and we were very lucky to have been supported by the platform Necessity to conduct this research. We felt that a lot of the research that is done on Lancaster's Black history is done and has been done by academics. But the way to bring about change, perhaps, is to involve community members in it so that they can have a sense of this for themselves and make up their own minds as to what is Lancaster's Black history. So we started something called the Slavery Family Trees Project, and one of our members came up with this idea of looking at various families, prominent families in Lancaster that have a link in some form or the other to transatlantic slavery, and seeing what that would highlight. We predicted there would be connections between these families, and we decided to work with 7 community groups. So the university, faith groups like the Cornerstone Group and the Priory, activists and voluntary groups like the East Meets West, and schools like Lancaster Girls Grammar School and Lancaster Royal Grammar School, which has both boys and girls in it now. And we looked at 7 families. It ended up becoming 8 because one of the families that we found out and through our research is the Booker family. And I'm only mentioning that because we're at a Lit Fest and everybody knows the Booker Prize. But what you don't perhaps know is that name Booker comes from the Booker, Josiah Booker, and he comes from this part of the world. That family managed plantations for another Bond family that we were researching. So, of course, we found out. And this isn't new research. Imogen's been working on this, but it was for these community members to find out for themselves. Amazing to think this is such an amazing story to link the Booker Prize to sleepy old Lancaster and Lancashire. I just wanted to say that as part of this research also, we collaborated with a range of institutions and groups. We collaborated with Lancashire Archives. So even though it was the pandemic and we were meeting up mostly on Teams, we had about 35 to 40 people that we were working with as community groups. And we worked with Lancashire Archives, we worked with Lancaster Museums, and I think Carolyn Dalton is here today. And we worked with an amazing group called the Sewing Cafe Lancaster. And we worked with them to collaborate on this slavery banner, which is going to be up in the Judges' Lodgings Museum. So it has been at the Lancaster Museum for all this while, since November, when we had our conference where we talked about the findings from our research project. So this slavery banner depicts the buildings and people that are associated with this part of research. So it's only 7 families. We're building on the work of people like Melinda Elder, who've written work on Lancaster's Black history in the past. But this is very much community historians, I suppose, everyday people looking at that history. So if you are interested in finding out a little bit more, you're very welcome to come along to the Judges' Lodging Museum and see the banner for itself. And it comes with a little leaflet that we've designed, which gives you all the information about the people and the buildings. And of course, these slave trails you'll find outside. You have a shortened version for less than an hour that you can do of Lancaster's Black history. And if you want to do the full tour, it's about 2.5 hours. So thank you so much for giving us a chance to come and speak to you about it. Our work, our research work continues, because what we have done is these narratives that have been written by community researchers, we're looking through that, we are providing feedback on it, we're going to get it peer reviewed, and then we are going to put it onto our websites and find different ways in which we can share this, especially with school children. So Geraldine is working on various projects where we are able to disseminate our work with primary schools and also in time with secondary schools. And we're also looking to see how we can take this slave trail. And Geraldine's been involved in doing a children's version of this and seeing how we can use that across primary schools in Lancashire. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sunita. I'm sure you did a great job. I was going to be roped into doing that, and thankfully Sunita stepped in, so I didn't have to remember all of that on top of everything else that I'm doing on behalf of my sister today. And if Richard would like to step up, Richard Atkinson, and tell us about your book, Mr. Atkinson's Rum Contract, and what impelled you to write it.
Thanks, Petra. With pleasure. So, hello, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you so much to Litfest for having me. So my book, Mr. Atkinson's Rum Contract, tells the panoramic story of my Cumbrian slave-owning ancestors. It draws on, quite literally, thousands of their letters, and is centred around 4 locations: London, Jamaica, Newcastle, and, last but definitely not least, a village called Temple Sowerby, about 6 miles from Penrith. It was at Temple Sowerby that my story would start when I was 4 years old, following the deaths in quick succession of my father and grandfather, and I inherited the crumbling, leaky old house that the family had called home for 250 years. My mother took the difficult, but for me liberating, decision to sell the house when I was 8, and for the past 40-odd years it has been a hotel. My dad had been an only child, and my sister and I grew up not knowing anyone at all on his side of the family. There were no aunts or uncles or cousins to tell us tall tales about the Atkinsons and their feats and achievements. All we had to go on was the evidence provided by some ancient oak furniture, a bookcase full of mostly 18th century volumes about domestic practicalities, animal husbandry, and matters of morality, and a random selection of objects, including the chipped remnants of a beautiful blue and white monogrammed dinner service and some stuffed birds of paradise in glass domes. For many years, I viewed my Atkinson forebears entirely through the prism of my own early losses, experiencing the voice of my ancestors as a kind of white noise, something that was always there, humming in the background. The white noise became louder and a lot more insistent in my late 30s when my wife and I gradually realised that we wouldn't be able to have kids. I had always imagined having a family of my own, and suddenly I was rudderless and feeling rather lost, fatherless, and unable to be a father myself. So at a time when most of my contemporaries were raising young families and looking to the future, I started looking in the opposite direction, backwards in search of my past family. This mainly involved hours on Ancestry.com and a gargantuan amount of Googling, but I was also fortunate to have some physical jumping off points. First of these was a cardboard box of mostly 18th century letters tightly bound up in pink legal ribbon that I found on a shelf high up while rootling around in my mother's house one day. But more exciting still was my discovery of an amazing cookbook, handwritten in 1806, comprising nearly 800 recipes compiled by one Bridget Atkinson, who I knew to have been my 4 times great-grandmother. I won't say more about this discovery, except that Bridget's cookbook turned out to be the magic portal through which I found my Georgian ancestors, in the form of thousands of their letters and documents scattered in archives on both sides of the Atlantic. Given the subject of this discussion, it won't prove a spoiler when I reveal that they turned out to have been heavily involved in the business of slavery. And when I say the business of slavery, I mean pretty much every grim aspect of this sprawling, evil trade, from the organisation of triangular slave voyages, the ownership of sugar plantations, the sale of human cargoes on behalf of ship owners, the hiring out of enslaved men to the British Army, and the rape of enslaved women. It turned out that my Atkinson ancestors, starting with my 5 times great-uncle, Richard Rum Atkinson, West India merchant, government contractor, director of the East India Company, alderman of the City of London, confidential advisor to 2 prime ministers, and spurned lover, and ending with my great-great-grandfather Dick, who retired from Jamaica in 1856, were either participants in or witnesses to pretty much every milestone in the history of empire between the 1750s and 1850s. I suppose at this point I could have closed the Pandora's box, which I had unwittingly opened, put my fingers in my ears and gone la 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 as if nothing had happened. But I didn't, partly because I found a grim fascination in piecing together their disturbing story, and partly because I felt a really powerful sense of responsibility to turn what I'd found into something positive. It did not take long for it to dawn on me that I'd stumbled upon the material for a book. All that was left for me to do was write it. And hey presto, here we are 10 years down the line. I sometimes wonder why I persisted in putting myself through what was at times a grueling and lonely business. I was motivated by a belief in the truth and a sense that the more awkward and problematic a subject seems, then the more it probably demands attention. I took pains when writing my book to be scrupulously honest about sharing the evidence of my ancestors' sins. I left out nothing that was incriminating or shocking. But I also took pains to take a measured approach and not to superimpose today's values on the events of 200 years ago. It was essential, I believed, to tell my story in an even-handed way. In other words, to tell it warts and all, and not simply warts alone. To have done otherwise would have been to do the history a disservice. I aspired to show, in a way that was quietly devastating, how a family such as mine, which was up to its neck in the business of slavery, could simultaneously enjoy a respectable middle-class existence, and also that while the slave trade was a monstrous business, a crime against humanity by any standards, that those who were involved in it were not necessarily monsters, at least not in the grotesque way that we tend to imagine them. I think it's quite important to understand this, as without doing so, it's impossible to grasp quite how central slavery was to the national economy in Georgian times, and thus the extent of the contribution it made to the fabric of Britain as we know it today, not to mention setting up some still glaring systemic inequalities. Slavery was an entirely legal business, established by royal charter and promoted as essential to the economic well-being of the mother country. Until the abolitionist movement really got going in the late 1780s, British people largely took slavery for granted as a necessary evil. My book came out in hardback in April 2020, 3 weeks after the start of the first lockdown and 5 weeks before the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. To say that the timing was unfortunate would be an understatement. Bad enough that all the bookshops were closed. After George Floyd's death at the hands of a white policeman, the mood in the discussion of the legacies of slavery suddenly, and quite understandably, grew a good deal angrier. There were certainly some readers who felt that I had neither sufficiently condemned nor apologised for my ancestors' behaviour, and I can respect that point of view, even if I don't agree with it. No one reading my book would imagine that I could understand that. No one reading my book could imagine that I could feel anything but revolted by the business of slavery. My feeling was, and is, that while I can't be held responsible for the sins of my ancestors, I can and must take responsibility for my own actions, which manifested in the most powerful urge to expose their sins through researching and writing this book. Conducting my research was a highly emotional business involving visits to 30 archives, including ones in Jamaica and the United States, the discovery of many long-lost cousins, and the shedding of tears of joy and sadness along the way. I believed that I was writing a complete family history, wrapping it up and putting it between two boards for posterity. But it was nothing of the sort. The story I told in my hardback, it soon turned out, was unfinished. One of the repercussions of the lockdown, you don't need me to remind you, was that events such as this one suddenly migrated online. Of course, in so many ways, the pandemic has been shattering for so many people, but I'm an eternal optimist and a habitual searcher for silver linings. And silver linings don't come much better than what I'm about to tell you. I had done various DNA tests for my book research, and from this, and also from the archival work I'd done in Jamaica, I knew that I definitely had cousins of West African ancestry, likely the descendants of my 3 times great-grandfather Matthew Atkinson, who I know to have been a serial rapist during the 12 years he was living on the island. The baptism records record at least 6 children with 3 different women. Although the DNA companies offer customers the tools to contact DNA matches, after much reflection, I'd taken the decision not to get in touch with my black cousins. Given who I am, the white, male, direct descendant of slave owners, it would be weird and intrusive, as someone in my position, to email the descendants of the enslaved. Soon after my book came out, I did an online event for a literary festival that was duly posted up on YouTube and thought little more of it. That is, until a few weeks later, when the festival director contacted me to pass on an email that was among the most extraordinary he'd ever received, he said. It came from a woman called Yvette Hewitt, living in America, in Minneapolis as it happened, and was addressed to me. She explained that her ancestors had been enslaved by my ancestors in Jamaica, and she was reaching out to me because she was involved in a local Minnesota genealogical group and committed to the principle of reconciliation through forging connections between families of slave owners and the enslaved. To cut a long story short, I leapt at the chance to contact Yvette. We soon established shared DNA ancestry. We are most likely 4th cousins descended from Matthew Atkinson. Moreover, and this is the piece of corroborating evidence that blows my mind, Yvette's father was born in a village in Jamaica that falls within the boundary of a sugar estate once owned by the Atkinsons. Yvette still has an uncle and cousins who live there. 2 years later, Yvette and I talk constantly, and even though we've discussed some really horrible, painful history, ours are easy conversations, full of laughter. We gave a joint presentation last week about our connection. I know that we'll soon meet in real life. Plans are being made. I hope that we might be able to share a platform such as this one of these days. I happen to know that she is watching this talk. Hello, cousin. And which really brings me back to the beginning. I started my genealogical journey because I felt the need to connect with my past family. I just didn't anticipate that I'd find a new family such as this. It gives me so much joy.
much, Richard. And next, Alex Renton, just speaking about his book, Blood Legacy.
Hi, everybody. I don't have a watch, so will you tell me? I tend to talk a lot, as my family says. Will you tell me when my time is up? Or more than a finger, a fist. Thanks. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here and great to be in a live event and see real people. So Richard and my stories kind of start similarly. I mean, we're both white children of privilege with history and history that we know. And when I was researching my book in Jamaica and in Tobago, where my ancestors owned plantations during the slavery period and owned African people, enslaved people, I quite frequently had lots of great conversations I had with people who now live on the land where we made this wealth and where we murdered people. Some people very kindly said, the difference between you and me is really that you know what your great-great-great-grandfather was doing on March the 17th, 1880. All I know is that mine was living in horror and fear and then disappeared into the ground with no record at all. And that is the big difference. And that's also where my book starts, with that enormous privilege of having access to a family history. And a bit like yours, Richard, my family, who my mother's family, the Fergusons of Ayrshire, about 2 hours north of here, were very big in the 18th century. They were generals, lawyers, members of parliament, and in a small way, owners of sugar plantations and enslaved people in the Caribbean. When I first found out about this, I had to get to the age of 55 to even realise this detail in my family's history. My mother said, my father said it was just like everyone else. We were in slavery a little bit and we didn't make much money. And this was the myth that had come down with something I grew up with, which is something that, a lot of English people of my kind of background will understand, which is a sort of an ancestor worship, and a very strong belief. Not only when I went to my grandparents' house of the ancestors looking down from the portraits of the great and noble things they'd done for the empire, but also that they had been part of the most benevolent empire that the world had yet known. That, while of course it had done a little bad, had done far more good. And this indeed was also how I was taught at school. And I think when you write, I've written a few books, when you write a book, often a non-fiction book is a process of educating yourself. And I look back at that self 5 years ago who started this research and realise how ridiculously ill-informed, badly educated, innocent I was. Not just about the realities of that period in British history, but also about, and this is where I'm most ashamed, because I'm a journalist, I could have known these things, just about how that history of British enslavement and the enormous amounts of money made then, how they still affect and corrode, toxify our society today. That racism today is a direct result of the things that my ancestors did to African people in the Caribbean. So I'd little on the process of the book. I mean, like you, Richard, my grandfather was a historian, and he'd catalogued 400 years of Ferguson family papers, which were sitting mouldering, they still are, in a basement in the big house where my cousins now live in Ayrshire. And I started poking through those and then realised I had to transcribe huge numbers of letters, and my mother helped and my son helped, and we all rolled up our sleeves. And those letters, are privileged to have them, and everything I have is now online, and anyone who'd like access to them can have them, because it's wrong for us to be the only people to have access to this history. But so I used those letters to tell a story of ownership of plantations in Tobago and Jamaica from the 1760s, right through to the post-slavery period, because we didn't sell the Jamaica plantation until 1875. And there's another story after the emancipation in the 1830s of neglect and abuse of the ex-slaves now in the Caribbean colonies, which, again, something I was never taught about. But I started, I mean, again, with this immense innocence reading the letters of my ancestors, a 6 times great uncle who went out to Tobago to try and make a fortune through buying Africans and land, writing back to his brothers who'd backed the enterprise. I think immediately the first revelation was how like me these ancestors were. I got the jokes in the letters. I felt empathy when my uncle wrote back from this lonely place at the edge of the world about how frightened he was, about how worried about money he was, he was talking to me. I felt I could be talking to a cousin today. And that seemed to me very important, because we watch Quentin Tarantino movies or 12 Years a Slave, and we see the people who did this as somehow other, as monsters. They were people like me, and highly moral people as well. I mean, in that they knew right from wrong. There's generosity and kindness in their letters. One of my uncles was rector of Glasgow University and a member of the Edinburgh Enlightenment. So it seemed to me an evasion to say that they were from another era, and that indeed judging them by today's values was wrong, because they seemed to me to be people of today. And the most scary revelation of all, really, I suppose, that I could be them, that with peer pressure, family duty and so on, I might have made the decisions about exploiting other human beings that they made. And that seemed to me important to tell. And the second thing that seemed to be important to tell was to ask the people, because no one in my family had ever done this, to go out and ask the people who descended from those, the 900 or so that we enslaved, what they felt, what they thought, what it meant to them today. And so that's the sort of the other part of my book, is looking at Jamaica and Tobago today and the legacies. As I say, the process of researching a book is a process of education. There were I'll just pick out 2 key moments, which I tell in the book, within the history of my family's involvement. And one is, I'd really got quite excited by how much I liked Uncle Jamie, 6 times great Uncle Jamie, the unmarried man who went out to Tobago, and wrote these funny, moving, sometimes quite beautiful in terms of describing the landscape, letters home. And one of the things that I found myself grasping at was signs of humanity. And I think he was blood. I wanted him to be a good guy. It sounds ridiculous, but and there are a couple of letters there where he writes about how he's living alone with the initial 20 African people he's brought to clear the land, to clear the jungle, setting up a new plantation, and that he works alongside them, and that they enjoy each other's company, and that he treats their wounds because he's the only white man there who's the one with the medical kit. And his elder brother, who's financed the whole business, writes back to him. Amazing, the continual letters, going across the ocean, saying, "I'm so glad to hear you are treating these poor people," referring to the Africans they jointly own, "as fellow human beings, with humanity. It is what I would have thought of a good man like you." And of course this lights all sorts of light bulbs, because I'm thinking that they were being treated like farm animals, and that my ancestors were justifying what they were doing because they did not see the black people as fellow human beings. They saw them as something lesser. And otherwise, as Christians, they couldn't morally have done anything else. But suddenly the ancestors are talking to them as real people. And this has got me thinking. But then the very next letter, Uncle Jamie writes to Uncle Adam saying, as we planned, I've bought 10 new Igbo Africans in the slave market in Scarborough and Tobago, and if you approve this, and I wonder if you will approve this, and there's a sort of some squiggles in the letter, which when you decipher them you realise there's a J and an A entwined, a logo, and it's their initials. And what he's saying is that if you approve this, I will then use it to mark the Africans, meaning he will write to Barbados and have a silver brand made with this J and A logo to stamp on their chests. And those sort of moments where you suddenly go, this is the reality. These are people like me who I believe occupy the same moral framework as I do, but they're capable of doing this. And then you come across a letter where, on Jamie's death, where they do an inventory of all his belongings, and the children on the estate are listed alongside the. Thank you. The children on the estate are listed alongside the cattle and the horses in terms of their prices, and you realise that a 6-year-old child is worth 2 cows. And that, again, I mean, going on through the letters, that difference between seeing people as less than human becomes more and more apparent, and explains really what was going on, and that becomes very important for to what I find myself concluding at the end of it. So Sir Adam, Jamie's older brother, the head of the family, is a really interesting figure. I mean, not quite well known in Scottish politics and history of the late 18th century. And he was a member of Parliament for Edinburgh and Ayrshire, rector of Glasgow University, a friend of Adam Smith, the economist, one of those posh Scots philosophers, if you like. And he, and he's a god in my family. I mean, he's our greatest ancestor, but in our family law. And he ran the plantation for 45 years. He never went there. He ran it from his desks in London and in Edinburgh and in Ayrshire. My tiny letters written to the Scottish employees, on the level of saying, I'm really cross that yet another woman has died in childbirth. Tell me why you've been so lax. And in the same tone, why do we need to build new fences in field number 5? And he, of course, was very involved in abolitionist politics at the time as the abolitionist movement starts. So in the run-up to, he's a member of Parliament in the Whig Party, or allied to the Whig Party. And, of course, the Whig Party includes Pitt and Mr Wilberforce, who are campaigning for and forcing a vote for abolition, as most of you will know. But, of course, my uncle is a plantation owner and a slave owner, so against abolition. And he writes a letter in 1792 when William Wilberforce made the first great speech for the first vote to abolish the slave trade, not slavery, the slave trade, which fails, as I'm sure you know. And he leaves the House of Commons and goes straight to his desk in his lodgings in St James's and writes using insider knowledge. Members of Parliament would never do something like that. Using his insider knowledge to write to the manager in Jamaica and say, get down to Kingston as soon as you get this letter, and buy more young women, because the price of slaves is going to go up, because eventually the trade will be abolished and we need to breed. So it's very clear in the end where they stood. And the usefulness of the letters you can then follow through as my ancestors become Victorians and moral and very religious and Christians and so on. They spend a lot of their fortune on building churches and schools in Scotland. Poor fishing communities are one of their big things up and down the Lothian coast. And they then, of course, when abolition came, they were compensated for the loss of their 198 slaves who they had to give up. But that money they spent on building churches and schools in Scotland, but not a single one in Jamaica. So it's a story, and it's a story that woke me up. I mean, and I have learnt hugely. And the other thing I learnt, and I was told this quite very strongly in Jamaica and Tobago, was just how slavery. I asked everyone I met how slavery affected them today, and almost everyone's talked about skin colour. And I know from the records how the children of the white that came from the rapes of the white workers on the enslaved women got better jobs, because someone with white blood couldn't be made to work in the field, they should work in the house. And everyone I spoke to in the Caribbean said that this issue around unfair treatment because of the tone of your skin colour is the one that still affects the most. And that comes directly from the racism of my ancestors and the systems that were employed elsewhere in the British Empire as well. So to finish, my book, I hope, is hopeful. I'm very interested, and there's a lot of discussions around with other families in the same place as mine around reparations and what we can do now, other than try to tackle and counter racism and inequality in Britain today. But there are other ideas too, which I won't go into. And the main thing is I've got a guru, really, a brilliant man called Sir Jeff Palmer, who's a Scot whose mother came over with the Windrush, and he's a professor and Chancellor of Heriot-Watt University, and he helped me a lot with my thinking around this book and with introductions in Jamaica. And Jeff has a line, he's a generous man, and he says, "You cannot change your history, Alex. The British can't change their history, but they can still change the consequences." And for me, that's hopeful. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We're now going to have a bit of a discussion between the four of us about the books. I happened to be, well, I was going to be in the audience today, and my sister said to me, she's like, "Oh, well, I'm reading this one. I'm going to start with Mr. Atkinson. So if you start with Blood Legacy, by the time it comes to it, when we're all having the conversation, you can ask some great in-depth questions." I was like, fantastic idea. Then she was struck down by COVID on Tuesday, and I've been nosing a book all week, really, trying to make sure that I... No, it's all right. It's been really interesting. But also because I'm reading it as sort of like, I'm the everyday person. You know, I'm not a scholar, I'm not a teacher like my sister. I'm the everyday person, so I'm coming from sort of that angle, which I think would work because you guys are the everyday people also. Also, I'm black, of course, and I'm coming from that side as well, which is reading these books was quite... It was a weird experience because there was times where I actually got exhausted because, you know, when you're hearing about what's happening to people that look like you, you're like, oh my goodness, this is exhausting. But one of the things that I found myself initially doing is rooting for the protagonist. So when I read, and I love reading, when you're reading a book, you want the main character to do well. You want them, you know, to succeed. And initially, I really wanted James Ferguson to do well. He was the youngest, and he was just trying to find himself, and everybody else who was older than was successful. And they just sort of went, "Listen, you got to do something. Go out to Jamaica and see what you can make of yourself." Tobago, sorry. Yeah. And then with Richard Atkinson, with Lady Anne Lindsay, who he was like in love with, and there was like a will they, won't they? And you're reading about these people and learning about them, and then in the next breath, they're doing something that is abhorrent to people that look like me. And I was like, hang on, Petra, get it together. Like, I don't think you're supposed to like these people. And then there was a dichotomy, you know, between wanting to understand them as people and then wanting to understand what they're actually doing. And I was wondering, I think you both touched on it slightly then, was that really difficult, having a kinship for your family and wanting to write about them in a way that what they did was monstrous and not trying to portray them as monsters. So I was like, did that dichotomy affect how you wrote about them? And was there an innate desire to almost protect them? And did that make the undertaking difficult? I'll start with you.
Brilliant. Great.
In you go.
Yes, it did. It was something I was aware of. It was I think it is a fundamental tension at the heart of my book, in that I went into the whole thing, and my motivation was to find my family, and it was to find, it was to make a family where I wasn't aware of having one before, and there was an innate sympathy to my family. I felt an innate sympathy, which is much as on some levels it would have been convenient not to feel that sympathy. I felt it. I couldn't help it, and the truth is, I think that, I mean, Richard Atkinson, the main protagonist who made all the fortune and who basically set up this whole family business in slavery, is in his letters an immensely likable character, and he's really sympathetic, and and I suppose I could have left out all the stuff that makes him sympathetic, but in a sense that wouldn't have been a rounded picture, and it wouldn't have. It wouldn't have made an interesting a story, but also I do genuinely think it wouldn't have done the history a good service. Absolutely. Because I think that we have to understand, in order to kind of get through whatever it is we're getting through, we have to understand that this history was just people like us. It was, it was everywhere, and it was. and it was threaded through the warp and weft of Georgian society. So it wasn't kind of people who were somehow beyond the pale.
Absolutely. I was going to say, touching on that, when James went out there and he was saying that he was appalled at what he was seeing. He was writing letters back going, this is outrageous what they're doing to people here. And then the old slave, the old planters were laughing, going, oh, well, we'll see how you fare. Once you've been here for long enough, we'll see how you... And he just kind of like slipped and slid into the everyday life of being a planter. And
well, I mean, I'm really pleased that you found him sympathetic, because in a way you're going through the same experience that I did in a way, and I wanted, because I think in my innocence I was going, could there be good slave owners? Is that possible? And I left at the end by going, to myself, I was deluded actually. That there is no, it was a crime against humanity, as you put it. It was genocidal in its scope. 3.25 million Africans shipped by the British alone, more than any other nation in Europe apart from the Portuguese, plus all their descendants, who we cannot count because we didn't keep any record of them until the end of slavery. It was, but I think it comes back to the fact that if we're looking at a world with a lot of very current evil in it, and it's important not to, whenever people go, oh, Putin's insane, he's bonkers, you go, well, actually that's not the point. He may not be. It's important to see these people as people like us, which they are. And I mean, in many accounts of the Second World War and people who served the Nazis, say the same. The ordinary people who have good feelings may also do terrible evil, and that's why I think seeing that I could have been my ancestors, that realisation was really important. So if we are to counter evil today, and goodness knows it's still around, this is one of the steps towards doing it. It wasn't people different from us who did that evil. And we British have I'm having a row with Jeremy Clarkson at the moment. So there's a piece in the Sunday Times about this today. We British are very good at saying we're exceptional, we're better than other nations. And it's a really not a healthy, useful thing to do, and it's not true. We're no better, but we can try and be better.
Absolutely.
I think that's,
your books were both written many years actually before George Floyd was murdered in 2020, yet by some sort of kismet they both kind of came out at the same time, and you now find yourselves in that larger story of racism and privilege. How did that affect the reception of your works? Because obviously Colston's statue was pulled down in Bristol and thrown into the river. Was there baying for blood? Did you feel like you put a target on your back by speaking about what your ancestors had done? Or
wait, should I go?
You go first.
I was sorry, deep in. Well, I have to say, I've got a very large family, a lot of whom share, have the name Ferguson, and this book still does cause a lot of trouble in my family, and some members of my family won't forgive me, I don't think, for doing it. And one of the, literally the book was sort of in its final stages of publication when George Floyd was murdered, and Black Lives Matter suddenly got big media, it was a movement that's been going on for years, but became big in Britain in media terms. And I, there was certainly a point with people going, what will you do if you get our windows smashed? And I, and that caused real ructions. And I mean, for me, I don't bear the name Ferguson, but though actually my Renton ancestors were also slave owners, but in a more minor way. But hey, I'm a white Briton. What do you think? I don't think that people like me, and there are tens of thousands of people in Britain who know that they are heirs of the privilege and wealth, if not still the wealth of slavery. I don't think we can be proud on one side and ignore the shameful stuff on the other. And I think, part of being proud of your ancestors and living, perhaps as some people still do, in grand houses, is also acknowledging the other side. And it's perfectly clear that if we get our windows smashed, it is nothing compared with what we did to those 900 people and their children. So it's pretty harsh stuff, but we live a comfortable, privileged life. And it continues to be problematic in my family. But I'm enough, particularly from the younger generations, think owning up to the story and talking about how we can take it forward was the right thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm not one to give, cookies to, well, that's the millennial term, I'm saying? I don't give cookies to people for doing the right thing, but absolutely, yeah, I agree with that, I would say. Putting it out there was the correct thing to do. And how about you, Richard, the reception? How was it?
My book came out 5 weeks before George Floyd was murdered, and it was interesting timing. People got in touch with me at the time and said, "How amazing! What extraordinary! What extraordinary timing! Your book's so timely. It's so much addressing the issues." But on the other hand, there were people I think there were people for whom it was difficult because it wasn't an angry book, and the mood of that particular moment was anger, and so I think that in terms of actually putting the word out, my voice wasn't quite right for that at that moment, and therefore it didn't help. George Floyd's murder was a I mean, let's be quite clear about it. It was so awful for so many people. Yeah. So much more so than for me. But it was definitely my book wasn't timed right for that particular point in the argument. It's better timed for now. Yeah. I hope, because I think we're in a way the conversation has, as it always would, broadened out. And there's room for more sort of strands of conversation.
Absolutely. Well done. Yeah. Another question. I was like, in Blood Legacy, there's a moment in Tobago where you were caught and silently scolded by some young boys when you take your camera up to take a picture of them working, and you scold yourself. And also, you were saying in the room contract that you were matching on ancestry with American people with West African descent who are here. Hello, America. And you held back from contacting them. Now, this to me shows that you've acknowledged that there is a white privilege there, that you that you've discovered your privilege, and you've held back and you've gone, oh, it's so silly of me in that moment, and you go, it's not for me to entrust myself on people who were harmed by my family. And I said, has discovering this privilege changed how you navigate day to day? And does it change how you inform other people of their privilege? Because obviously these are big things that you've learned and you've got to put them into your day-to-day work. And how has that changed for you?
I mean, I think I'm certainly much more aware of it. Much more aware of it than I was before. I wouldn't say I go around telling people to check their privilege, because that's not quite my style. But it's clear that I think for certainly for me, even though I've been doing all this work for kind of the best part of a decade into my family and slavery, and obviously I'd navigated a lot of the history and I'd found it extremely grim, but I was seeing it as a sort of at one stage removed, if you like, because I wasn't my family were not the victims by any means. I think. So where was I? It was how was I?
No, I was like, how was acknowledging your privilege changed your day-to-day life? Perhaps how you interact with people of colour.
I think what surprised me, and what even though I should have probably known better, was the degree of the depth of the public anger that came out when George Floyd was murdered. I don't think I knew the reasons for it. I understood the reasons for it. I got it, but I couldn't quite. I hadn't quite understood the real sort of almost the volcanic depth of anger.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I think I mean it's been a huge learning process. I look back at. I mean, I've been a liberal journalist all my life. I've reported post-colonial conflicts across the world. I'd worked for Oxfam for 5 years. I thought I was a good white privileged person, and I realised I was just an ignorant smug one. Really, I mean, it's
Pay attention, everybody. Pay attention.
I have a brilliant 17-year-old daughter in the house who keeps me grounded on all these things. But I think this, I wrote the introduction to my book was written literally just as the BLM Britain demos were having, and I there was a sign in one of them, a sign in a Holyrood, an Edinburgh rally that my daughter and I went to, and which was someone wrote, "It's a privilege to learn about racism instead of experience it."
My sister was there on that day, so yeah.
And I think it's that. I think having it's just realising that there's a whole load of things that as the white middle class privileged man, I have to now realise. And one is that I've got to stop telling people what to think. Certainly got to stop telling black people what to think about racism. Mm-hmm. I need to listen and hear, because people like me have been in charge of this history, have had sole ownership of this history, and the politics that have created the systemically racist society that we live in today. My father was a Tory MP, and it's time that we. One friend of colour said to me, I've talked to a lot of friends before I started the project about what I should do with it, and one of them said, "You know what I want to know? I don't want to read any more slavery horror. I've read enough of that. I want to read how you white people are going to heal yourselves, because you're the problem, and your psychosis, and your aggression, and your denial of this history is the problem." So I try to think that one through before I talk too much.
That's a good answer. I like that.
On that note, I'm very sorry, but we're already at 4 o'clock.
Oh, I'm so...
which is great, because it's been a fantastic conversation. So what I want to do now is say we will do Q&A for 10 minutes, but when we've done that, I really have to bring things to a close. Now we have questions from in the house, and I will take the microphone to whoever raises their hand, but there will be questions online as well. And sorry, looking over my other shoulder, you got one or two there? Not yet, but they may come. So who would like to ask a question? Yes, I can see at the back there.
Hello. Thank you for those very interesting presentations. What struck me was a mention of not learning about this history at school, and I think I was very lucky. At the age of 10 at a Blackburn primary school, our teacher read us, first of all, a book designed for children about Wilberforce and the fight against the slave trade, which moved us children very much, and then went on to read us a book about the Earl of Shaftesbury and his fight for the Factory Acts. And those two things, since the age of 10, have always occupied the same part of my mind. The obviously awful abuse of slaves by the ruling class of this country, simultaneously to the boys who were my age at the age of 10 in the cotton mills also being exploited. And there has been talk about the descendants of the slaves and the descendants of the slave owners, and I'm just wondering how you reflect about the people who were equally being exploited by that same class of people within our own country.
Good question. I mean, I'm sure that there's digging to be done, and I'm sure there's acknowledgement to be done. Who's doing the work? I mean, that must be a line of historical inquiry. It's not. It's a more. I imagine that the problems are. It's a more difficult one to unpick, perhaps. I don't know. Alex, do you have a particular insight into this?
I have quite strong feelings about this.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't conflate. You know, I did a lot of people. I've had a lot of aggressive reaction to my book. And I regularly get people coming out and going, where's this all stop? Why don't I ask the Romans to say sorry for raping British people when they invaded 2,000 years ago? And you go, this is of sui generis. This is of its own kind. The reason this is a problem, what we did to African people still directly affects our society today. Still toxifies our society today. Still, black people die at 4 times the rate of white people from COVID. Explain me that. It's not genetic. It's to do with systemic racism. So we can weep and rub our hands over all sorts of human ills, including modern slavery and trafficking of women from what's going to happen to those poor Ukrainian women next. But this was something we did with total legality, as you pointed out, and we gave people no more than the rights that farm animals had. Now, the children who had to work in Lancashire mills, as far as I know, were salaried. They had rights. You couldn't take their children away from them and sell them. This was an act, among many evil acts, but an act totally of its own, and it does a disservice to those who are descended from the people we exploited to conflate it with other crimes that may have been committed under capitalism. Capitalism exploits people. This was a particular form of exploitation, and it's
a particularly persistent form, where the ripples are so much greater because they are here.
I mean, one other very quick point. Do any of you remember Our Island Story? The great history book that we all grew up with. My grandfather, it was published in print for 100 years.
I think they might have just brought it out again.
I think it still exists.
They did a new
First
version.
published in 1903. My grandfather read it as a child. My mother did, and I did. I've got the 1948 edition. 500 pages. It's where you learnt that Alfred burnt the cakes. It's the British traditional history book. Under slavery, in the 500 pages, there's one entry in the index, and there's one page, and it's titled "How Wilberforce Freed the Slaves." Now, you may have had. That's the education I had. It doesn't sound very different from yours, but it did cast us as the good guys rather than the worst guys in transatlantic slavery. So,
Absolutely.
Can I thank you for all your work today? It's been fascinating. And the work needs to go on, doesn't it? Whether it's a personal story or a historical one. From a sort of white man's perspective, I have been quite shocked with Black Lives Matters. I've had a very good background, history, distinguished in the sense of relatives fleeing from Nazi Germany, 94-year-old mother, etc., etc. But what has shocked me has been the indignity of white people behaving towards Black Lives Matter. And obviously I followed Africa very carefully, the Truth and Conciliation, whatever it is. I'm not a big social media person, but I have been shocked at the indignity of people being frightened by Black Matters, the jokes, and as I think you suggested, when's it going to end, all this? How far are we back? And that makes me very, very cross, because it's even more important now. And obviously we've got world events now and itself. So I just wanted to make that statement. The work that you're doing is absolutely fabulous. We haven't even touched the surface of our own understanding of ourselves, really.
thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's fine. You go ahead, and we'll go to the online question.
Hi, just a quick question. This is about Tobago. How did Tobago become? Tobago is a small island off of Trinidad. How did Tobago become a place where your relative decided that he could go, and what made him go there? Was it like, okay, land available here and slaves available here? Come and make your way. What? I haven't read the book yet. Sorry.
Yes. So there was a peace treaty with France that had owned Tobago in 1867, and the British took Tobago off the French, and despite the fact that there were native Caribbean people already living there, carved it up in square lots and sold them by auction to lots of 300 acres of land and to anyone who bid, and one of those who bid was a Glasgow merchant off whom my family bought that 300 acres. And Scots piled in there, as they did into many of the islands at that point. And there was already, the trade of enslaved people from Africa had already been going 140 years by that point. So they just diverted the ships to Scarborough and Tobago, and you bought Africans, naked Africans on the shore side, again by auction. So legal and very modern as well. I mean, it was a government sold you the land.
So we've got 2 questions from the online audience. The first is from Yvette Hewitt. Hello, Yvette. So her question is, what are the next steps in your personal journeys of discovery?
You want to go first, Alex? Or shall I go first?
You go first.
Well, Yvette, it's down to you. No, I mean, I feel very, in the sort of aftermath of the publication of my book, it's taken me quite a bit of time to actually work out what kind of book it is I've written. And I beat myself up quite a bit in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder for it not being kind of activist enough, really. But I'm not, you know, I'm just not naturally that guy. You know, Alex is and I really respect the need for activists and the good that they do in terms of moving things on and making real necessary changes. It's just not my style. But I beat myself up a lot for not being a kind of, you know, someone who piles in on Twitter. I'm not on Twitter. I just don't like it. I hate it. I hate kind of polarized thinking. And I've realised that basically it was always for me a book about my family. I just didn't know what I was looking for. And so in a sense, finding Yvette, hi Yvette, was in a sense the kind of final destination. It's just that actually I didn't get to it in my hardback. I got to it in my paperback. Yeah. So the preface to my paperback talks about the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and how Yvette reached out to me, and it was just a beautiful thing. And I would like to think that for me, the next stage of my journey is to do with helping to forge reconciliation between families of slave owners and the enslaved.
That's really interesting. I'm kind of going to jump on that really quickly because I was going to say, because reparations, which is the acknowledgement, apology, recompense, and for some, ultimately, the ability to return to the homelands, is a great desire of many descendants of those directly who were enslaved. Sorry, those descendants of enslaved Africans, and many believe that those who benefited from the spoils of slavery should spearhead those efforts and give back. And what are your thoughts on that? And have you started to give back to these communities? Would you like to give back to these communities based on what you now know about what your families have done in the past?
I mean, I'm very interested in in the final chapter of my book, I go into reparations and interview people involved in the reparations, the governmental reparations movement there. I do think if someone mentioned the South African Truth and Reconciliation process, which worked. A lot of people in the Caribbean talk about what happened between Germany and Jewish people after the Second World War, you know, where reparations and an accommodation, only 100 years after the end of British slavery, you know, where you enabled two nations or two peoples to go forward with understanding and friendship, despite the horrors that had happened. I think that governmental process and sub-governmental process is really interesting. In Scotland, because the English government has refused to talk about reparations with the Caribbean nations. It's not just about money, it's about education and friendship and visas. We're talking in Scotland about whether we should start talking directly to the Caribbean governments. That could be interesting. On a smaller level, if you go to my book's website, there is a page on reparations. And my family, in a very token way, and some other families like us, have found a range of educational institutions and charities in Britain and there who we are trying to support. But it's a token. You know, it can only be a token. I could sell every single thing I own in my family's house in Edinburgh, and How do I begin to pay back for those 900
No,
lives and all
absolutely.
those descendants? But my journey forward, as a journalist and as a person in this, I think racism and inequality, insofar as there's anything a white privileged man can do anything about them, that's got to be my focus.
And at that point, I'm afraid this very interesting and important discussion must be brought to a close. So, thank you everybody for coming this afternoon. Thank you for supporting LitFest in the work that it does. I just want to say that we will be following up on these themes in future festivals. That the project that Lancaster University is doing, the Atlantic Slave Trade Project, seeing what happened to the compensation of £20 million in 1837 that was paid to former slave owners, what became of it and how did it shape our history? There are such important questions that we need to deal with. And of course, right at the moment, we're in a period where we don't seem to be able to look at our own history and see it true. And these books are contributions to finding that history and learning our real place in the world, all of our real places in the world. So finally, please join me in thanking Petra Onek, Alex Renton, Richard Atkinson, and Sunita Abraham for providing a really interesting talk and discussion this afternoon that takes us forward, I think, already. Thank you very much.